Well, thank you all for coming this evening. I can promise you'll get away safely in time for the football. Just a few thanks. I should give special thanks to people who apparently are watching this through the powers of new technology in Scotland and America and Manchester and Newcastle. So thank you for joining us. And I just want to give a particular thanks, as well as to the RSA team who've coped with me as I've been working on this speech, with the people who post on my blog site, who having spent years having a virtual relationship with me. Many of them have been invited tonight, so I do hope we get on afterwards. Now, our fantastic colleagues at Cognitive Media have created some slides for me tonight, which I hope will, yes, there they are. Now, you'll see that the first bit of work is actually an animation, and it's fantastic. Now, actually, we had the whole of my speech done as an animation, but when we did a dress rehearsal, it became far too clear to me that the people watching were so much more interested in the animation than they were in me, that because I'm the chief executive, I said that it was probably better for us not to have an animation. So after this initial piece of work, you'll see just slides, but I think the rest of the animation is going to be available later on when we meet for a chat after the lecture. Actually, the RSA Animate series has been a massive hit. I think our most popular lecture has now been viewed nearly 1.5 million times around the world. So it's been a great way of getting our ideas discussed. And attending those lectures, and in fact chairing quite a few of them, I've come over the last few months to see an interesting divide emerging in the speakers that we've had. On the one hand, there are people like the science writer and self-styled rational optimist Matt Ridley. Now, Matt recognizes that the human race has made many mistakes, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, but he believes that the same tools of exchange and technological innovation that have brought us prosperity, longer, healthier lives, less violence, amazing new experiences and possibilities, that those tools won't just solve the problems that we face, like climate change, but will bring us new prosperity and opportunities in the future. In fact, a friend of Matt's, David Eagleman, spoke in this room a few weeks ago, and he has examined the reasons why every single civilization in human history has fallen. And he argues very convincingly that the internet will prevent any future civilization collapsing. So these are the optimists. On the other side, we have people like James Lovelock, who's also spoken in this room, who believe that humankind's hubris has already wrought undoable wrongs on the planet, that we have long passed the point where ingenuity can save us, and that we must resign ourselves to a process of adaptation in severely reduced circumstances. Or just a few weeks ago, we had the Australian thinker Clive Hamilton. He argued that optimism itself is a serious obstacle to taking the action that we need. He maintains that blind faith in future technology is a kind of psychological coping mechanism, allowing us to delude ourselves about the scale of current environmental and economic challenges. So, the optimists are pretty happy with Enlightenment values and where they've got us to. Meanwhile, the other group often sound as though they think that possibly Enlightenment values have done more harm than they have done good. And these are the debates that have been raging in this room. Now, coming as I do from a New Labour background, there's only one possible position for me to adopt in this debate, which is to triangulate. That is to say that Enlightenment values, the kind that gave rise indeed to this very institution, are important, but that we need to think again about what they have come to mean to us. So, the reason I'm making this speech on this topic tonight is that the RSA has a new strapline, and that strapline is 21st century Enlightenment. And the original Enlightenment in the 18th century was not, of course, a single cohesive movement. It didn't have a simple start and finish. You'll probably recall the answer given by Zhou Enlai when he was asked in 1970 what was the impact of the French Revolution, and he said, "It's too early to say." Kant talked about the Enlightenment as humanity emerging into adulthood. So when we think about the core ideals of the Enlightenment, it's not simply a kind of historical process. It's in a way, when we think about how those ideals have shaped modern values, norms, and lifestyles, it's a kind of process of cultural psychotherapy. We're delving into what has shaped the collective consciousness of modern people. And that enables us to explore critically whether those values and what they have come to mean to us still work for us, and whether they meet the challenges that we now face. And what I want to argue in this lecture is that in critically examining what Enlightenment values have come to mean to us, what we can now bring to bear is powerful new insights into human nature, insights that have emerged from a variety of scientific disciplines and social sciences over the last 20 or 30 years. Because Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton helped to lay the ground for the Enlightenment by revealing that the laws of nature not only failed to conform to religious doctrine, but also they failed to conform to intuition. So the Pope might have said the sun went round the earth. It might have felt like the sun went round the earth, but science showed otherwise. And I think that insights into human nature have a similar double impact, challenging not just the orthodoxies of modern culture, but also unsettling our intuitive sense of ourself in the world. Now, in his recent book, In Defense of the Enlightenment, the philosopher Tzvetan Todorov suggests 3 ideas were at the core of the Enlightenment project, and I want to focus on those ideas: autonomy, universalism, and the human end purpose of our acts. In relation to autonomy, the idea that every individual should be able to make their own choices, free from unreasonable religious and political constraint, I'm going to argue that we need to aim for a self-aware form of autonomy, informed by a deeper appreciation of the foundations, the possibilities, and the frailties of human nature. In relation to universalism, the idea that all people are deserving of dignity and share fundamental rights, I want to argue that we should pay more attention to our capacity for empathy, because this is not only the sentiment which drives universalism, but it's also a vital competency for us if we want to thrive in an interdependent world. And in relation to the humanist principle, that we should organize the world according to what is best for human beings, I want to encourage us to recognize that the question, what is progress, raises substantive and ethical questions which we should be more willing to acknowledge, to honor, and to debate. So, there's plenty of scope for argument between optimists and pessimists, but I would argue that there is a kind of general consensus on the key challenges facing national and global society. How is it that we achieve the benefits of economic growth, particularly necessary in the developing world, and in fact all human civilizations rely on economic growth, while at the same time managing environmental limits? How do we deal with the contrast between powerful global forces, whether that's commerce, crime, conflict, at the same time only having very weak as yet global civil society and governance institutions? How do we manage risk and shape progress to human ends when science and technology and commerce are so complex and fast-moving, something that we've been considering in the last few days in relation to what's been happening in the Gulf of Mexico? Now, my first RSA annual lecture tried to explore the implications of these challenges for citizens in terms of our attitudes and capabilities. I described what I inelegantly called the social aspiration gap. This is a gap, I said, existed between the kind of future that most people aspire to in a country like this and the kind of future we're going to create relying on the ways in which we currently think and behave. And I said that gap had 3 dimensions. First of all, that citizens in the future needed to be more engaged, to understand the kinds of difficult dilemmas that their leaders faced, to give their leaders permission to make the right decision for all of us for the long term, and to recognize how our own behavior shapes the choices available to our leaders. Secondly, I argued that citizens need to be more self-sufficient and resourceful, and this, of course, is particularly true in the context of a long period of public sector spending constraint that we're moving into. Whether it's looking after our health, continuing with our education, saving for our retirement, being willing to set up a business, we need to be comfortable with managing our own lives and confident about taking initiative. And then finally, I said that we needed to be more pro-social, behaving in ways which strengthen society, contributing to what David Halpern, who's sitting in the front row, has called the hidden wealth of nations, our capacity for trust, for caring, and for cooperation. So whilst I don't underestimate the ability of human beings to invent and to adapt, in the end, on balance, I do favour the view that we need to live differently in the 21st century if we're to be resilient and if we are to thrive. And as the architects of the Enlightenment understood, to live differently involves thinking differently. It involves seeing the world and ourselves from a new perspective. So let's talk about autonomy. At the heart of the Enlightenment project is a commitment to the autonomy of human beings to create self-authored, valuable lives. Now, of course, throughout the Enlightenment and ever since, debate has raged about the implications of that ideal. One set of issues concerns how individual autonomy can be reconciled with the collective good. Civic Republicans, for example, argue that autonomy can only be realized in a society which also exhibits civic virtue. Yet, by the end of the 20th century, a combination of factors, including particularly the rise of consumer capitalism, had seen the idea of autonomy sequestered by the shrill ideology of possessive individualism. And as I discussed in last year's lecture, this ideology has even been superimposed on our idea of democracy. With the decline of deference and class-based politics, the principle the customer is always right has been imported into the political sphere. But the problem, as I pointed out last year, is that the voter is not always right. As our leading pollster Ben Page has said, the public want something very simple. They want Swedish welfare on American taxes. Another example is that most voters, overwhelmingly voters, say they want more power devolved to the local level, but an equal majority say that public services should be the same everywhere. Now, it's not actually that people are stupid or unreasonable. The interesting thing is this, that the preferences that people express in mass polls of individual opinion are different to those which they reach after a process of group deliberation. But when politicians and commentators genuflect to public opinion, it's generally to superficial individual preferences that they refer, not the outcomes of informed collective deliberation. I've made a bit of a hobby of mine, actually, studying how reasonable the public can be towards politicians. It all goes back to when I was a county councillor in Warwickshire, and we were discussing a school closure. And at the end of the meeting, I was about 24, I think, at the end of the meeting, someone came up to me, and he said to me, I never forget, he said to me, it's absolutely disgraceful. And I said, well, what is? He said, well, what you're wearing. I think I wasn't wearing a tie. I wasn't wearing just a jacket. And he said, absolutely outrageous. And I said, look, trying to defend myself, I said, look, I'm just wearing, I'm just wearing ordinary clothes. I'm just an ordinary person. Yes, he said, I'm rather afraid you are. So individualism has been subject to a range of philosophical, sociological, and political critiques. And meanwhile, public opinion and public policy has kind of gone to and fro on a spectrum, the individualist, collectivist spectrum. But what I want to argue, of course, is that in recent years, the work that I talked about earlier in areas as disparate as economics, evolutionary psychology, and neuroscience have provided new grounds for questioning the way in which we understand autonomy. So, for example, most of our behavior, including social interaction, is the result of us responding automatically to the world around us, rather than the outcome of conscious decision-making. And in this sense, it's more realistic to see ourselves as integrally connected to the social and natural world, rather than as a separate, wholly autonomous entity. The research is clear. If you want to be a happier person, don't read a self-help book, just have happier friends. And there are other lessons that we can learn from the more subtle and holistic model of human nature now emerging. You know, we're not very good at making long-term decisions. We're much better understanding relative than absolute values. And as we found out in the credit crunch, we are enthralled to what Keynes called animal spirits. Perhaps even more startlingly, we are very, very bad at predicting what's going to make us happy, and we're even bad at describing what made us happy in the past. So I would argue that the moral and political critique of individualism now has an evidence base. And it's with this in mind that I argue that 21st century Enlightenment should champion a more self-aware, socially embedded model of autonomy that recognizes our frailties and limitations. Now, this does not mean repudiating the rights of the individual, and nor does it underestimate our unique ability to shape our own destinies. Indeed, it's actually by understanding that conscious thought is only a part of what drives our behavior that we become better able to exercise self-control. In my lecture last year, I used a simple metaphor. Well, I thought it was simple. for human behavior of an elephant being ridden through a cultivated jungle, in which the elephant, there he is our conscious, the rider of the elephant is our conscious thought, the elephant is our automatic systems, and the jungle is our social context. The skillful elephant rider is not under the illusion that he can take any route at any speed he likes, but understands the habits of the elephant and the advantages and pitfalls of different paths through the jungle. So appreciating that as individuals we are continuous with the context we occupy, understanding the emotional basis of reason, and acknowledging our cognitive frailties, all of this can enable us to distinguish our needs from our appetites and our amazing human potential from the hubris of individualism. It's the basis for self-aware autonomy. Now, Todorow's second Enlightenment principle, universalism, is generally taken to mean that all human beings are born with inalienable rights and equally deserving of dignity. And the question of what these rights should consist has since become one of the defining issues of post-Enlightenment political discourse. But the question that is less often asked is, what is it that drives us to act on the principle of universalism? It's one thing to sign up to the ideal, even in its more minimal versions, but it's another to put it into practice, particularly when this requires us to make sacrifices, or when those whose rights are denied or threatened are distant or different. So I want to argue that of all the attributes which we might seek to nurture in modern citizens, living as they do in the more diverse communities that make up our more interdependent world, the one that matters most is our capacity for empathy. The developmental psychologist Robert Kegan argues that successfully functioning in a society with diverse values, traditions, and lifestyles requires us, in his words, to have a relationship to our own reactions rather than be captive of them. He goes on to write of an ability, and I quote, to resist our tendencies to make right or true that which is merely familiar, and wrong or false that which is only strange. Now, the good news, and it is really good news, is that there's every reason to believe that we can expand empathy's reach. Despite major departures from the trend, most terribly in the 20th century, the history of the human race has been one of diminishing person-to-person violence. Since the advent of modern civil rights, we've seen a revolution in social attitudes based on race, gender, sexuality. Furthermore, real-time global media have brought the suffering of distant people into our living rooms, and immigration, emigration, and foreign travel all provide us with opportunities to put ourselves in other people's shoes. Not that it's always quite as simple as that. I got a cab the other night with a cab driver who was Nigerian. I was chatting to him, and he turned to me and he said, you know, he said, London is great. There's just one problem, too many Somalians. But there are reasons to ask whether the process of widening human empathy has stalled, and at just the time when we need it to accelerate. After 4 decades of post-war progress, levels of inequality have risen in the rich world. Tensions between different ethnic groups persist and have taken on new dimensions. Anti-immigrant sentiment has grown, arguably reflecting a failure by policymakers to balance the imperatives of globalization and the ideal of universalism with the empathic capacity of the communities most affected by change. From gangs to the impact of violent video games, there are worries about young people. Globalization and public deficits may mean that future generations in the West face tougher challenges than their parents. And in fact, just this month, a paper to the American Association of Psychological Science aggregated information from studies of 14,000 college students and found a growing decline in empathy in comparison to the late 1970s. And on the bigger stage, despite the growing interdependence of the world, the national frame for political interests, which became dominant around the time of the Enlightenment, shows little sign of weakening. A recent RSA speaker was the development economist Paul Collier, and he told his audience that in his view, the institutions of global governance are, if anything, weaker than they were 20 years ago. So the stock of global empathy upon which democratic leaders can draw has to grow if we're to reach agreements which put the long-term needs of the whole planet and all its people ahead of short-term national concerns. Now, I think it's reasonable to presume, and indeed there is some evidence to suggest, that those who are most relaxed about outsiders in their midst are also those most inclined to be sympathetic to the plight of strangers far away, or even to the interests of future generations. But the chain linking interpersonal, communal, and global scale empathy is complex. I'd simply argue this: intellectuals, politicians, and interest groups, and think tanks spend an enormous amount of time debating what should be the content of universalism, which rights, which entitlements, which capabilities. But shouldn't we perhaps just spend a little more time exploring the foundations of universalist sentiment? What is it that enhances and what is it that diminishes our empathic capacity? The policy implications range from a continued emphasis on the early years of child rearing, to developing schools as intelligent communities, to exploring the way popular culture inclines us to think of other people. For example, a culture which prized empathy would be one which distinguished the healthy activity of public disagreement from the unhealthy habit of public disparagement. We are used to, it's become a cliche, that education is the most valuable resource in a global knowledge economy. I would argue that fostering empathic capacity is just as important to achieving a world of citizens at peace with each other and with themselves. But even were we to have more self-aware and more empathic citizens, they would still face dilemmas and differences of opinion. And Todorow's third Enlightenment principle is what he calls the human end purpose of our acts. In other words, the basis for social arrangements should be what increases human happiness and welfare, not what's dictated by the words of gods or the whims of kings. But if gods and kings aren't to decide what's right for us, then how are we to make those decisions? Of course, the utilitarian answer lies in maximizing human happiness, and if progress is measured in these terms, we have done well since the Enlightenment, there is little doubt. The poorest citizens of the developed world now have better health, longer lifespans, and many more resources and opportunities than those who would have been considered well off a century ago. But sometimes it feels as though the idea that progress should be designed to increase happiness has turned into the assumption that pursuing progress is the same as improving human welfare. The success of the Western post-Enlightenment project has resulted in a society like ours being dominated by three logics: the logic of science and technological progress, the logic of markets, and the logic of bureaucracy. And the limits of the logic of science and of markets lie in their indifference to a substantive concern for the general good. If something can be discovered and developed, it should be discovered and developed. If something can be sold, then it should be sold. And the problem for bureaucracies, as Max Weber pointed out 100 years ago, is a tendency to put the rationality of rules above the rationality of ends. Now, sometimes these three logics of science, of markets, and bureaucracy, they clash, but often, it seems to me, they amplify. And as globalization and the evident power of markets make competition more intense and pervasive, there seems to be, in the private sector, the public sector, the voluntary sector even, one overriding rule: whatever helps the organization successfully to compete is right. And as globalization advances over public spending, the logic of bureaucratic competition will become only more overbearing. And so it's in this context that the 21st century Enlightenment project demands a reassertion of the fundamentally ethical dimension of humanism. How can we make it easier to ask, is this right? Because an incurious or utilitarian approach to human progress leaves us without a framework or even a language through which to inquire more deeply into the kind of future we want. Just take one example. Is it to be a world where so many of us feel that the shape of our lives is dictated not by the ideal of a life fully lived, but by social convention and economic circumstance? Why should we cram education into the first quarter of our lives, desperately balance work and caring in the second and third quarter, and then feel that we're going to suffer second-class status and a fear of neglect in the final quarter? But so powerful are the logics of progress that it can sometimes come as a shock to be reminded that as well as lacking all our modern comforts, citizens of pre-industrial periods also enjoyed many things that we might envy: shorter working hours, more festivals and parties, stronger community and family bonds, for example. You see, rationality can tell us how best to get from A to Z, but without ethical reasoning, we cannot discuss where Z should be. We know the evidence that the relationship between wealth and well-being amongst the well-off people of well-off countries has become attenuated. The Danes, apparently, are the most contented people in the world. And not just because they're materially comfortable, but because if you ask the Danes what matters most to happiness, they say relationships. The most miserable people are the Bulgarians, because if you ask the Bulgarians what matters most, they say money. So what we aim for can be as important to our well-being as what we achieve. I can't resist this conversation of national characteristics, and I hope there's no one German in the audience, by telling the story of little Hans. The story of little Hans is that little Hans was born as a beautiful boy, but he didn't speak, and he grew up. He was wonderful in every way, but he just didn't speak. His parents tried everything, but he would never speak. And eventually he was 9 years old, and he was being served his supper, and his mother gave him his tea, and he turned to his mother, and he said, "This strudel is bitter." So his mother thought that she must be making a mistake, and said, "Little Hans, I thought you spoke." And he said, "No, this strudel is bitter." So she's overwhelmed with delight, and she goes to get Hans's father, brings him in, said, "Say to your father what you said to me, Hans." So this strudel is bitter. So they're embracing each other, so delighted. And they turn to Hans, and they say, before they phone everybody and tell them, they said, "But Hans, you're 9 years old, we took you to speech therapy, speak to the doctors, you never spoke. Why did you never speak?" And Hans says, well, he says, "Up until now, everything was satisfactory." But one of the peculiarities about the difficulty we have about having substantive and ethical discussions is that there's more and more evidence that we are profoundly ethical beings. In a recent Yale University experiment, babies between 6 and 12 months old, so pre-language, watched a simple colored geometric shape ascend a slope. And when other shapes intervened, apparently either helping or blocking the shape, the children's response showed a clear preference for the helping shapes. The evolutionary biologist Mark Hauser has conducted a huge global online survey of moral judgments, and he argues that subtle, but from a modern perspective, idiosyncratic moral distinction appear to be found in all cultures and amongst all human beings. Many share the concerns of secularists about the encroachment of faith into public policy, but while we might want to keep religion out of politics, we need to acknowledge, as the anthropologist Scott Atran has shown, that all of us, religious or not, hold values which are sacred to us. And we also need to recognize that those logics I described before, those logics of progress, are themselves dependent on an often unrecognized ethical framework. Markets rely on trust, bureaucracies on duty, and scientific progress on collaboration. Now, of course, we need the right regulatory frameworks for global commerce and controversial areas of scientific experimentation, but to rely on regulation as a way of ensuring we do the right thing is like trying to turn a clay pot using a rule book. Just as a potter relies on skills and a sense of the aesthetic to shape the spinning clay, so we need business people, public servants, and scientists who've internalized the tenets of ethical practice. And returning to the problem of political engagement, something I feel particularly acutely as I watch the rather dispiriting contest for the Labour leadership, a willingness and an ability to debate substantive and ethical matters is necessary for an authentic and engaging politics. An Enlightenment politics, which is about human ends rather than a technocratic politics of regulatory means. Now, the leading contemporary historian of the Enlightenment, Jonathan Israel, who we hope will be speaking here soon, has described the Enlightenment as a revolution of the mind. The changes in our ways of thinking since the 18th century go beyond ideas. It's not only our explicit beliefs that have changed, but our whole way of thinking about ourselves and the world that we occupy. And to many in the Enlightenment, the aim of the project was not simply to replace one set of beliefs with another set of beliefs. Its champions argued that the nature of the true and the good should not be received wisdom, but should emerge through reason and open discussion. And in fact, Kant himself was amongst those who recognized the danger of Enlightenment values becoming their own dogma, forgetting the limited and contingent nature of human rationality. As Michel Foucault says of Kant's own description of the Enlightenment, it has to be conceived as an attitude, an ethos, a philosophical life in which the critique of what we are is at one and the same time the historical analysis of the limits that are imposed on us, and an experiment with the possibility of going beyond them. To be responsible, to create a big society, to live sustainably, this is not simply a matter of will. The 21st century Enlightenment calls for us to see past simplistic and inadequate ideas of freedom, of justice, and of progress. Perhaps it's time to stop chasing those myths, to stop being transfixed by abstractions, and instead to reconnect a concrete understanding of who we are as human beings, to political debates about who we need to be, and philosophical and even spiritual exploration of who we might aspire to be. Now, if all this sounds pious and unrealistic, I would contend that there are already some trends and practices in modern society which appear to align with the principles of 21st century Enlightenment, a shift in public policy towards the recognition of the vital importance of early years development, the time of attachment when identity and the capacity for empathy is most firmly moulded. The signs that in developed societies we're beginning to take mental health more seriously and developing the same sense of agency about addressing mental as physical well-being. And one of the advantages of this is that it means there will be more psychiatrist jokes. My favorite being the man who walks into the doctor and says, "Doctor, doctor, I think I'm a moth." And the doctor says, I can't help you. I think you need to see a psychiatrist. "Why did you come here anyway?" And the man says, "Because your light was on." And thirdly, we are continuing to see in academia more multidisciplinary and cross-pollinating research on human nature. And this further strengthens the chances of developing more holistic understanding of how human beings operate and better models for enhancing human capability. There's the evidence that I hear every day that in the race for talent, corporations are increasingly having to prove to recruits that they are genuinely committed to social responsibility, and the number of young people, or people of all ages, who are trying to set up what are called social businesses, organizations where the question, is this the right thing to do, is always relevant. Or there's the attention being paid to fostering interfaith dialogue, which is important when you think that by 2050, 4/5 of the world's population will probably be believers, a process which involves identifying unifying themes in ethical frameworks, talking respectfully about difference, and collaborating on humanitarian missions. And even a greater willingness, let's see if it survives the economic situation, but a greater willingness amongst government organizations, as well as many others, to question conventional measures of economic growth in favor of a more inclusive model with greater emphasis on well-being and sustainability. The Enlightenment prompted a more reflective public discourse, the emergence of what Jürgen Habermas calls the public sphere. And just as institutions like the RSA created that space in the 18th century, so we need new and reformed institutions to create a 21st century public sphere. And each strand of the RSA's work can make its contribution to new ways of thinking. Our lectures and other commissioned content open up exciting ideas about future challenges and human capabilities. Whether it's our work exploring civic engagement, our competency-based curriculum, our work on the social brain or community networks, all our research projects seek to explore the conditions for closing the social aspiration gap. But most of all, the reimagining of fellowship is itself in pursuit of a new ethic of collaboration. Creative people who want to make a difference have 1,000,001 opportunities and distractions. To engage them means an ethic which is intolerant of negativity, rigid thinking, and self-promotion, and instead keeps people constantly in touch with the words of the anthropologist Margaret Mead. True to the spirit which created the Enlightenment, true to the spirit which moved the founders of the RSA 256 years ago, and true to the spirit of the aspirations of our fellows today. Margaret Mead said simply this: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." Thank you.
Many thanks, Matthew, for an enormously thought-provoking lecture. I'm going to leave plenty of time for lots of people to contribute, but there were just one question, which I have to confess hit me very strongly, and I obviously have a very personal interest in this. The last line was about new institutions to cultivate and enrich a public sphere. I've spent my life in an institution which is just as much to do with the Enlightenment as the RSA is, which is a newspaper. I work for The Guardian, and newspapers were indeed the creation of the kind of culture of that 18th century Enlightenment, and have been crucial to developing a public conversation and a public debate. And I just wondered, newspapers are going through a massive question about what their future will consist of, what it will look like. And I just wondered if you had thoughts about what those new institutions that can support the public sphere, because they were so crucial, the institutions such as the RSA, such as newspapers, such as coffee houses, to that process of debate and conversation, which the RSA and The Guardian have always upheld?
Well, I think first the good news, which is that if you'd asked sociologists and marketing experts 20 years ago about the habits of the affluent, they would have said that people would continue the trend that they had seen, which was to spend more and more time sitting in their houses, playing with the increasingly sophisticated electrical entertainment equipment available to them. And although actually we spend a lot of time in front of screens, what has actually happened in the last 10 years is that there has been a flowering of people doing stuff together, whether it's going to art exhibitions or rock festivals, or in fact, we have, this room is full 3 times a week with people who want to come to lectures. So people, they actually, there's a kind of return to authenticity, to experience, to doing things with each other, including talking about how to put the world to rights. So that's on the positive side. I think on the other side, it's a question really of innovation. If you look at the internet, the number of people over the years who've come to me with ideas for how it is they can create a space on the internet which will encourage people to talk politely and deliberate and to listen to each other. And of course, they've all failed disastrously. I seem to be the only person, by the way, who has polite people posting on my blog. Unfortunately, you don't, Madeline. I noticed the other day after the article that you wrote.
Definitely not.
But for institutions, it is a big challenge. We've been involved in some work with NCVO, the National Council of Voluntary Organisations, with membership organisations. And, the basic model of membership organisations was shaped in the 19th century, and it's hierarchical, it's bureaucratic, it's centralised. And to be frank, it simply doesn't work. And what we've been trying to do with the fellowship, moulding the change, is to try to change the way in which our membership works, to get rid of kind of committees and bureaucracy, and instead to focus on people doing things together. Because the real challenge is this, and I experienced this in the Labour Party, I think it's true of all political parties, that there are lots of really talented people who want to make a difference to the world out there, but the one characteristic they've got is they've got a very low boredom threshold. And if you invite people along to meetings which are boring, and you say to them, get involved in bureaucracy, they will not stay. And that's why many of those Victorian institutions, were ailing, and why it is they have to go in for radical reform. Unfortunately, most political parties haven't done this. So I think it's about innovation, about a commitment to change. One of the, perhaps I shouldn't share this, it's private pain, but one of the characteristics of voluntary organizations is that bad people are better at driving out good people than good people are driving out bad people. You go to a kind of meeting of your residents association, there has to be 2 awful people there, and you never go back. So designing institutions in ways which encourage people to work together, which kind of stop people who want to impose bureaucracy and hierarchy, because we have to have those collective institutions. We can't simply have single-issue groups and protest groups. And the idea that we don't need to worry about political disengagement because people sign petitions is ludicrous. We need those kinds of institutions, but we're going to have to remodel them.
Right, there are roving mics on both sides of the room. If you could just indicate, I will take a few questions in a group, and then Matthew will respond. There's some very tentative hands creeping up, but there's somebody right at the back, and then if somebody else could move the mic into the middle. There's 2 in the front. There's a lady and then a gentleman just behind her.
Thanks very much for that excellent lecture. Thank you. It's Michael Paulin here, Director of Exploration Architecture. It seems to me that there is also a trend that you could describe as the endarkenment, and I'd just be interested to know how significant you feel it is. You could point to, say, the rise of creationism in the US. There's a certain Danish climate skeptic that I better not mention. And in this country, the LM group, who've argued quite vociferously against evidence-based thinking. I was just wondering how significant you think that trend is.
Right, endarkenment. There was a lady here. Sorry, who's got the mic? Yeah, the lady. Yeah, if you. And then
hello.
After that.
My name is Patricia, and I had the pleasure of contributing to the blog. And I would like to reiterate a problem I raised in my final contribution, which is that maybe it occurred to you that Todorow's triad is inconsistent. There's a problem with autonomy and the human end or human goal of our actions. In the sense, if you think of autonomy as self-determination or self-legislation, if you claim that we don't know what makes us happy, we clearly should not be in charge of determining collective, universal happiness, right? So I can see how you try to overcome this, proposing this new self-embedded notion of autonomy, where we are put in a context where it's made easier for us to choose the right things. And here's my question. I mean, would you say that we should maybe go through a transition period where we use pre-Enlightenment means, some sort of a nanny state intervention, where we are taught how to be autonomous?
Mayor Hillman, can I just say at the outset, I loved your lecture, I really did. Found it very stimulating. But I'm left with the critical issue, which I think we've all got to face up to, which is the central issue of our time, indeed of any time, is the future of mankind. And we are on a trajectory towards making life less and less able to be maintained around the planet. And it is a horrific prospect. And I think that we need enlightenment in order to come to terms with the fact that there is a fundamental contradiction between the way in which we have evolved, hardwired towards seeing ourselves as individuals and our families and our clans and then the regions and then the nations and then the global interest in that order, whereas the response towards the future, considering the future as it must be in order to ensure survival, is that we reverse that process. In fact, that we reverse it even more dramatically than I've indicated with that list by saying the future generations, and I don't just mean our grandchildren, I mean future generations in perpetuity, hopefully, which we all hoped for when we were children, but now have to come to terms with the fact that that is extremely unlikely. So I think we need to face up to that reality. How do we cope with this fundamental contradiction of having to reverse what we are hardwired into, which is to think of ourselves first and the global and indeed future generations last, in terms of our actions?
Well, there's three really big questions there, so perhaps we ought to just tackle those three.
I'll be brief about in response to them so that we can take more. You know, I suppose in the end I'm just an idealist when it comes to difficult debates, and I think that it is better to have debates with, you know, we had Bjorn Lomborg, who you referred to, speak here. I think it is better to have debates with climate change skeptics than not to. You know, I think that if you don't, you know, I think the problem, what has happened to the climate change debate, if you want me to be honest, is that why would I be honest, is that that people have come to feel that something is being smuggled in behind the science. And my view about the argument about climate change, for example, is that we need to make it a very simple argument, which is that the science may not be certain, but the risk is certainly greater than the risk of our house burning down, and we insure our house. Now, you know, why don't we just insure our future? You know, we don't have to say it's 100% certain to happen. We don't have to say it's going to happen in 5 years. It's just a simple piece of good, effective governance for ourselves and for future generations. And
what about Morris's point, which is that we have to reverse what, quote-unquote, hard wiring, so that we have developed... Well, he was making the premise, I know, yes, which is what I think you need to tackle. He made the premise that we have evolved in a certain way, and that actually we've got to reverse that evolution process.
See, it's really important, and I may not have got this across correctly in the speech. It's a subtle point. When I talk about the importance of human nature, it doesn't mean that I am a determinist who says that we are simply slaves to how it is that we have evolved. I think what is amazing about human beings is our capacity to intervene in our own destiny, both individually and collectively. You know, I think culture is incredibly important. As Martin Rees said the other day, we may never understand the mystery of consciousness. It may be that consciousness is not able to understand consciousness. And things do change dramatically. I mean, nobody would have predicted 30 years ago, to take just one example, that the transformation of people's attitudes on the issue of sexuality. I mean, this is, you know, quite remarkable. People might have, I'd imagine people in this room advocating, saying, you know, what can we do about, you know, homophobia? And people saying, oh, well, of course, you know, really homosexuality has generally been frowned on in cultures. It's hardwired into us. We'll never be able to change that. And of course, culture has changed those attitudes incredibly quickly. So when I talk about human nature, I don't mean by that determinism. What I mean is it's by understanding how we work that we become better able, actually, to intervene individually and collectively in our future. So I don't, and also, as I said, the story of empathy is of expanding circles of empathy. And Jeremy Rifkin, of course, has argued here in his book, The Empathic Civilization, that there's a kind of race against time, climate change, environmental despoliation versus our capacity to expand empathy. So I'm not pessimistic, but I think part of the process is one in which we liberate ourselves, this is the theme, of course, of the speech, from certain ideas about what progress is and about what freedom is, and about indeed what justice is, that's part of the process of us having individually and collectively more control over our destiny.
There was a lady in the front, her question about should we be taught to be autonomous?
Interestingly, I'm glad you asked that question. We published a report yesterday, the RSA published a report called Steer. And in fact, it's very similar to your argument, although it's not kind of compulsory state autonomy training. I'm glad no one suggested that to Gordon Brown. But what we argue is that, you may have remember about 2 years ago, there was an awful lot of excitement about Nudge. In fact, we had the authors of Nudge, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, speak here. And the idea of Nudge is that if you understand our cognitive frailties, you can redesign policies around them. So, we're not very good at the long term, so you opt people into pensions and they don't bother to come out, rather than waiting for people to opt into pensions because they never do it. Or you redesign a cafeteria so the fruit is easily in reach and the sticky pudding is farther away and all that kind of stuff, which is fine. Nothing wrong with that. Steer, the approach of Steer is to, rather than that rather paternalistic approach, is to give people the tools to understand what it is that drives their behavior. And so, for example, to understand that context is often more important than will, and that lots of the things that you want to change in your life, and you try and change and you beat yourself up because you can't change them through an act of will, actually, if you change the circumstance in your life, you might find it a great deal easier. To understand when our intuition is normally right, and some of the circumstances in which our intuition should be questioned. And we did a very small piece of research with a group of people, and we gave them a kind of set of tools, basic tools for steering rather than nudging. And then when we asked them a few weeks later whether they'd found these useful, they said that they found them incredibly useful, that this had been something that made them feel more effective in all sorts of ways. Now, it's a very small sample. We're going to do a much bigger piece of work. So I think that explaining this to people is liberating. And actually, I talked about the expansion of mental health, but I think there are other things going on. There's been a great growth, for example, in something called mindfulness, which is a kind of secular form of meditation, a non-spiritual form of meditation, which is just about people getting more in control of their own kind of emotions and feelings. Now, I think this is good. This is basically good stuff. So I think to understand how it is we operate as human beings is liberating. It's not an abandonment of autonomy.
But it is a bit of a problem with autonomy if we can't actually predict what will make us happy, which was what you said in the speech.
We can't at present predict what makes us happy because we haven't read the right books. No, because if we'd read David Halpern's books, we'd all know what makes us happy. We'd move to Denmark and have, I think we moved to, David, tell me, we'd move to Denmark, we'd have a garden.
Well, no, we'd have to have been born Danish, because actually the Danish don't particularly necessarily like foreigners.
Well, okay, fine, that's a complicating factor. But no, the point is, our instincts, this is the point I tried to make, our wants are not the same, our appetites are not the same as our needs. And to know that doesn't mean that you deny individualism or individual rights. What it means is that you encourage people to understand that, if you buy a new car, it makes you happy for 3 weeks. Whereas if you get an allotment or a sharing of allotment, it makes you happy for 20 years. Now, everybody in the country knew that buying a new car or having a spare bedroom, a house with an extra bedroom that you never use, doesn't really make you very happy. But, being a joint owner of an allotment is really fantastic. But call me kind of soppy, but I think the world would be a better place if everyone knew that,
I'm not going to call you soppy. There was an endarkment question at the back, which we haven't tackled.
Well, my point is you have to drag the people in the dark into the light, and you have to have debates with them, even if you disagree with them. And also in that debate, well-meaning people have to understand that the kind of people you don't like, and I don't like really either, they often have the best tunes. And environmentalists can often sound as though they absolutely love the fact that we can't go on like this, that they glory in it, and that they think, when we all live in a yurt and knit our own yogurt, it'll be a better world. And that kind of puts ordinary people off. So, sometimes you have to debate with people you don't like in order to recognize how good their arguments are, in order to be able to be better than them next time.
I think there's a few tweets, is that right? These are from our audiences around different parts of the UK and indeed America, right?
Yes, and in Chattanooga. This is a question that's come in from Vivs, who's with a group of fellows who are watching in Manchester. And they've asked, how can fellows make a difference on a local level? How do we inspire the good people?
Right. That sounds like a fixed question. But I don't mind. You know, it's good. Obviously, control freakery is working in the RSA. Well, look, I'll give a very short and simple answer to that. You know, what bonds people together is doing things. You know, what doesn't bond people together is forming committees. And so what we've been doing in the RSA is encouraging people to do stuff. And so 2 months ago, we launched, it was an idea of our chairman, that we launched a kind of little venture fund, so a little seed corn fund. And so every month we make small grants up to a couple of £1,000 available to groups, of, not an individual fellow, but groups of fellows who have an initiative and they want to do something about it. And the interesting thing is, I went to quite a lot of fellows meetings when I first arrived, and maybe it was my New Labour background or maybe other characteristics of mine, but it didn't gel immediately everywhere I went, I think is one way of putting it. And so I would kind of come to kind of feel a bit nervous about these meetings, and I went to a meeting in Scotland about 3 months ago, and I didn't know how it was going to be, what with me being English as well. And what they talked about was not John Adams Street and the things that you complain about, membership organisations and who was going to be the next chair. They only talked about the effect that had taken place as a consequence of small grants they'd given to a number of fellows. And you know, there was someone who'd set up a community garden, and there were people in the room who said, well, we'd like to set up a community garden, how do you do that? And what was great, it wasn't so good for my ego, but what was great was after about an hour and a half, I realised I could leave and nobody would notice I'd gone. So, you know, the way that fellows make a difference is focusing on that question of, you know, what is it in Manchester we could make better? What is it we could improve? What could we do? And if you do that, then people do work incredibly collaboratively.
More questions? If we work up that side of the room and then come round to that side. So there's a lady 3 rows back.
It's another RSA plant.
Yeah, an RSA plant. That was a great lecture, Matthew, and I really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask a question about you identifying bureaucracy as one of the barriers to achieving a better future, because it would seem to me that sometimes legislation and bureaucracy are some of the ways that we curb our self-interest and our prejudice. And you mentioned sexuality, and I think that the kind of change in attitudes to sexuality is an example of that, where legislation has actually then driven a kind of change in opinion and a more tolerant attitude. So I'm wondering whether you think there are kind of opportunities and a role for bureaucracy and legislation in actually creating that better future, rather than it always being a barrier.
Great. We'll take a few questions. If you could, about 2 rows back, there's a couple of hands up in the middle of the row. If you could just pass the mic along.
Oh, yes. Hi. I teach in philosophy, art theory, and also art practice, so I particularly enjoyed your cartoons, Matthew.
Not mine, unfortunately.
Oh, well, your inspiration behind them anyway, because an image is often worth 1,000 words. Who's going to disagree with Enlightenment values? I don't think anybody. But Goya said something, yes, it was the sleep of reason produces monsters. And you mentioned Weber, and I wanted to ask you, what about German philosophy? For me, the only real philosophy is really German philosophy, because it sees Enlightenment reason as itself a form of sleep. You know, this whole division between body and mind, subject and object, observer and observed, and all that sort of thing, produces a kind of spectator relation to the world, where rulers are cut off from the ruled, those who, this spectatorism, it was nicely captured, I think, on your elephant trampling through the urban and vegetarian thing with the mirror, the sort of Narcissus, you know, the Narcissus problem of perception as a circle, just looking at itself. My question is, you know, for German philosophy, the Enlightenment stopped short of thinking about thinking. I mean, the whole paradox of perception, that it is this sort of circle that ends in closed patterns of thinking that give us the sort of thing we have today, you know, neoliberal economics, the arms trade, and the ecological meltdown, and all these sorts of things, you know, where we just sort of, the world swings between a sort of atomized vision of things and a holistic vision of things. So I'm wondering, any input from German critical philosophy, hermeneutics, dialectic, that sort of thing. The Frankfurt School critiques of the Enlightenment seems particularly crucial here.
And next door to you, yes, I think there's another hand.
Duncan Lowy, fellow and occasional commenter on the blog. One of the things I would say about self-awareness is that to some extent it's actually having an empathy for yourself, and that's one of the reasons it's valuable. You can actually come to recognize yourself in a different way. And moving on from that, I mean, empathy, I suspect, is limited by the Dunbar number, by the number of people you can actually personally associate and conceptualize. And if you look at things like social businesses, they work while they're small. It's very easy for Google to say, don't be evil, when they knew everyone in the same garage. But it changes a bit when they become a global enterprise with global perspectives. And I think their original motto has failed somewhere there. So is empathy just fundamentally limited by how many people we can actually see?
Okay, shall I take those?
Yeah, I was just kind of doing a sweep through this side of the room, and I think it's right at the back. There was a couple of hands. Yeah, great. If you could just pass the mics back.
Thank you. My name's Tim Fox, and I'm a fellow of the RSA. Just a quick question about the third point in your lecture about ethics and ethical humanism. You showed a pointer that showed that one good sign was that we were getting a more kind of interfaith world, we're getting a more interdisciplinary world. So the question I want to ask is, whose ethics are in the front of the humanism?
Right.
Okay, I'll answer these and as quickly as I can. The first question was about, I've written it down, I can't read my own writing. What was the first question? Oh, bureaucracy. Yes, sorry.
And the role of legislation.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue, very briefly, that I think regulation works when regulation goes with where human beings want to go, and generally speaking, it doesn't kind of work if it goes in the right grain with human nature. I would say bureaucracy and regulation are very different, and I do think there's a fundamental problem with bureaucracy. I think Weber was right, which is that I think bureaucracies do become dominated by procedural rationality, and therefore you do have to break them up. It goes back to actually the point about the Dunbar number. If you can break bureaucracies up into smaller units, which can have a sense of mission and purpose and autonomy, it's fine. But large bureaucracies, I think, are fundamentally problematic. And the point I was trying to make in the speech is that when you add bureaucracy with competition, I think you get a particularly ethics-free zone, because it becomes impossible to say, well, why is the bank doing this? Well, because every other bank's doing it, and we've got to compete. And I said this in passing. I work in the third sector, and you would think, wouldn't you, charities were a kind of haven from this kind of bureaucratic competitive spirit. But I don't know if anybody else works in the third sector. But, we compete for government grants, we compete for philanthropy, we compete for media coverage of our reports, So I do think that put intense competition together with bureaucracy, and it becomes a space where it's really very hard to raise these kind of questions. And you hear again and again, we heard it through the credit crunch, people saying, well, I tried to raise these questions, but it just felt like I was being disloyal to the organization. In relation to the German school, I've got kind of two answers to that. One is I don't really understand the question because it's too clever, but the other is that in as much as I did understand the question, I thought that was what the speech was about. So maybe we'll have to talk afterwards, because I tried to make the point at the end, the Foucault point, which is that Enlightenment should not be seen as a dogma. Actually, the fourth principle of the Enlightenment, I talked about autonomy, universalism, and humanism. The fourth principle is precisely the idea that the right and the good emerge from, discussion, and they're not out there. They're something which we create through discourse. And so you'll have to recommend some text to me, and maybe next year I can be more philosophically sound. In relation to the Dunbar number, which is the idea that we only have a certain number of people we can know and be friends with. Well, I agree, but that's about friendship. And what I tried to say in the speech was that we need to find out more about the links between interpersonal and group empathy and collective empathy. We do know, as I said in the speech, there is research that shows that people who get on more easily with people different to themselves do tend to be more kind of globally minded, more humanitarian globally. We need to understand these kinds of things more. And of course, you're right, absolutely right in what you said, which is that the development of empathy is absolutely vital to the development of identity. So it is actually through empathy, through the connection with, it is through seeing and understanding the emotion, when a baby understands the emotion of the mother and sees its emotions being reflected in the mother's responses, that's where identity comes, and that's where empathy comes. And so if that doesn't work, you're left not just with people who, you're left with people who have a very weak sense of identity and a very weak sense of empathic capacity. And then the fourth question was about
ethics.
Who's ethics? Well, again, I'd go back I'd refer to the earlier question, which is, I think the point is, I would say that the very process of ethical debate is good for us, actually. And in terms of what the outcome of that is, well, that's something that we have to debate, and we have to recognize that, in a way, it'll never be an outcome in which you persuade me of your ethics and I persuade you of mine. We have to say, how do we live together in a world, a diverse, interdependent world where we have difference? But let's start from a recognition of that, rather than feeling that it's something that we can't talk about, or suggesting that only certain rather extreme people have, sacred values, or only religious people have sacred values. Something I was going to put in my speech, I took it out, is that, people who are non-religious say that religious people who talk about the sanctity of human tissue are kind of irrational, but they believe in the sanctity of human rights. Well, the idea of human rights is much more recent than the idea of the sanctity of human tissue. So, we compete, we all have a kind of a notion of the sacred, and we should have conversations which respect that aspect to us and respect that it is part of who we are. That's the starting point. I think if you have that starting point, and people who work in the interfaith area suggest, to me this is right, if you start from that point of respect, then a good conversation is likely to ensue. If you start from the position that anybody who has kind of religious beliefs or sacred beliefs is somehow irrational, and that you who do not have those beliefs are rational, then that is a very bad starting point. That's a kind of Enlightenment fundamentalism, in my view.
I think we have another question on tweet, right?
Hi. Yeah, Matthew, we've got lots of tweets coming in, actually. Fellows in Newcastle have been discussing this empathy thing quite a bit over the Twitterverse, and asking how as you just mentioned with Dunbar's number, might empathy be limited to the number of people that we see? We've got a question again from Jamie asking how can autonomy be fostered within traditional structures, like perhaps the RSA might be perceived as. And finally, a tweet saying, Matthew, where was all of this in the recent election? Not really seeing any real change of this level in the mainstream parties. And
well, I would say it was in the recent election in a whole number of ways. I think one way it was in the recent election was this problem with a politics of consumerism, which says that the vote is always right, and so you end up with a political debate where people, and we saw this in all the polling. In fact, we did some polling in the RSA in our 2020 Public Services Commission, or the commission which we host. And people said, in answers to one set of questions, the politicians are all lying to us about what has to happen because of the deficit. And then another set of questions, if they were presented with anything that actually would have to happen which might affect them, they said, we don't want that to happen. So people's view is that something terrible needs to happen to deal with the deficit, but it doesn't need to affect them. So, I think it was a kind of insight into the dead end of that kind of consumerist model of politics. But the other thing is, I think David Cameron is to be commended for, in his debate about the big society, didn't go down very well on the doorstep because people didn't really understand what it meant, and maybe it was too quick, it wasn't enough time to get that idea out there. But at least he was talking about the fact that we probably do need to change in certain ways, and that is a debate we need to have, and that politics is not just about what politicians do, it is about what we do. And I was at a seminar this morning organized by the 2020 Public Service Commission. If you look at not how deep and how long this public service austerity is going to be, and when you think about the fact that we've got rising demands through population aging and various other things, I know alarmism is always dangerous, but we really are going to have to get used to living in different ways and making different types of contribution over the next few years, unless we're going to just live in a world where things get cut year on year on year and we just accept a kind of declining public sphere. We're going to have this debate.
Last batch of questions from that side of the room. I know you've been very patient. There's two gentlemen in the front row here, and then I'll move backwards. So,
thank you. Well, this is a very thought-provoking lecture. But my problem arises with it when you apply it to the institutional context, especially in the context of international politics. If, example, you take example of this climate change, the people who are the polluters, the countries, are in the West, and they have the power, resources to do things. Yet the countries which are being hurt mostly, by and large, are in the South, who do not have the power and resources to change course. So how do your ideas of these three core ideas of 21st century rationalism are relevant to resolving that issue?
And the gentleman next to you, I think, was also had his hand up.
I'm sorry, I'm introducing a rather discordant note, you see. You mentioned about empathy and universal empathy, but it seems that we in the West, you see, don't extend empathy to downtrodden people like people in Gaza, Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, and we have a blind eye towards their problems.
And just moving further back, there were a couple of hands. There was a, yeah.
Hi, I'm Catherine Priss from Play England, and one of the things that really strikes me is this really important about empathy, relationships, understanding, happiness. These things start in childhood, and I'm really glad to hear you mentioning about early years. But one of the things that we're seeing more and more is children's childhood curtailed, and their ability to go outdoor and play and work around in packs and like learn from each other and learn from children is massively curtailed. And we know that children's understanding of relationships starts by building relationships with other children. So how do we create a society that builds empathy, builds an understanding of their ethical humanism from the outset, without it being taught, without let them arise from their play?
And there was, if you pass that along the row, yeah, there's a gentleman in the middle.
Andrew Hadley, Director of Momentum Youth Development. It seems to me that this discourse, and probably the similar discourse in the 18th century, is actually the domain of the socially and intellectually privileged. And you've mentioned people getting together to do things, going to galleries, fellows of the RSA, etc. But there is a vast mass of the population of this country, particularly young people, who are not doing so. And I'd like to ask you whether you think this matters. If it does matter, how would you engage those parts of the population? And just to comment from my own perspective, I would say that it matters very greatly with respect to the question of the endarkenment, which is a good word. I think there's one very fundamental problem that your lecture has indicated. The endarkenment message is very, very simple, but your message is quite complicated.
And there was a lady standing up who's been very patiently holding her hand up, and that will be the last question, I think.
Thank you very much. Hilary Suckley from an organisation called Matter, which is about making new technologies work for us all. I spent my entire life in multi-stakeholder meetings with NGOs and businesses and government thrashing through these questions of risk and whose risk and opportunity and all these trade-offs. And we liked very much your phrase, in theory, of just because we can do something, it doesn't mean we should do something. And we've been having a think about it. But then it comes to the thorny issue of then who says we should or shouldn't. And as with your new Enlightenment sort of agenda and the big society, you get more and more opinions, views, very sort of entrenched and widely held views. How then do you decide who says it should or shouldn't be done? And I don't know if you have any views on that out of your thinking.
Right. I'm impressed by your intellectual stamina, Matthew, but this is
okay,
the last
we promised people we'd be out by 7:15, so I'll answer these questions really quickly. Look, in relation to the first 2 points, I get the point about the failure of global institutions. I made that point. And I get the point about the fact that very often it seems that humanitarian instincts in the privileged parts of the world are not anything like they should be. I think the point I was trying to make is that that's what I think we need to try to understand slightly more. The point I was making is that we spend, I mean, maybe it's just a personal experience, but since I did my sociology degree and in think tanks and in the Labour Party, and I have spent so much time discussing what should be the content of universalism. As I said, which rights, which entitlements, and dancing on the head of a pin about that, reading my rules and all of that kind of stuff. So all about the content of universalism, but not enough about the sentiment of universalism and where that comes from and how you enhance it. And I took stuff out of my lecture about this because I'm kind of really fascinated by the fact that we are in a society where we've stopped the kind of disparagement of people due to kind of, or not stopped, but it's much less disparagement of people due to race or gender or disability or sexuality, but yet we seem to replace that with a constant drumbeat of indignation against, teenage jobs or single mums or, asylum seekers, wherever it is. It seems like there's a kind of fixed quantum of indignation that we've got to kind of put somewhere, and of course the newspapers are very good at telling us where to put it. And actually a line I think I took out of my speech because it just felt too kind of pious, or maybe I left it in, I did leave it in, was that, we need to, a culture that cared about empathy would be one which recognized that disagreement is healthy, but disparagement is not. And a lot of the reason why we don't do things for people in other parts of the world is because we've kind of heard a little story that says, well, it's really their fault, and they're different to you. And if you were in their circumstances, you wouldn't be starving, or you wouldn't be oppressed, you'd be fine. So it doesn't answer your question, but I think we need to understand more what are the foundations of the sentiment of universalism. In relation to the point about deprived people, well, Andrew, what was your point? I wrote your name, but then didn't remember what your point was. Oh, yeah, yes, that's right, yes, no, that's right, yes. I'm sorry, I do kind of talk in unnecessarily complex ways. My father's just left, actually, but he was the one who told me the joke about what do you get, because I did a sociology degree, when you cross a sociologist with a member of the mafia, and the answer is someone who makes you an offer you can't understand. So that may have been a characteristic of my speech. Let me say something very specific about this. I think that we underestimate the resources that exist in our deprived communities. And a piece of work that we're doing at the RSA, a project called Connected Communities, is really fascinating in this regard, because what it's about is understanding the social networks that exist in deprived communities. And I think what very often happens is that public agencies come into those communities in a very well-meaning way and create their own kind of infrastructure and their own institutions, and don't understand that actually it's in deprived communities that the most resourceful people are, because if you've got no money and you live in a pretty grotty place, you have to be resourceful to cope. And the Connected Communities research, which is being published, I think, in July, it shows that we did very detailed research on who were the people, who were the shakers and movers in New Cross. And what we found was that they weren't actually the people engaged with all the kind of public initiatives to improve the area. They were the bloke around the pub, or the person who the football team, or just somebody who'd lived there a long time, or the janitor or whatever. So there were lots of resources in that community, but they were kind of untouched by the people trying to do good to that community. And so if we understand the importance of social networks to people's capacity, so we understand that the reason people don't get on if they're living in deprived communities is often because they've got very weak social networks, understanding what exists and enhancing that rather than coming in a well-meaning way is one way. So we do think very hard about how this kind of agenda does apply, not just to kind of people who want to come and spend a Thursday evening at the RSA. And then finally, I don't know, the seminar I was at this morning where I talked about the importance of public deliberation in the context of public service austerity, and that if we're going to really make difficult decisions, that if you say to a school you've got to cut your budget by 10% and they just do it without engaging parents, it'll be disastrous. But if they engage parents and teachers and even some of the school kids and say we've got to save 10%, how are we going to do this? Let's work it through. They could actually find a creative way of doing it. And it was interesting, the debate, the seminar this morning, full of kind of quite nice people, but they all just thought I was being stupid. That, their basic view was you can't trust the public to have that kind of conversation. They're all kind of, incapable of being anything else. That's not my experience. Maybe this is like kind of people used to argue about, one day there'll be real socialism. But I think the reason that consultation and deliberation doesn't work is usually because it's just very badly designed. And because the questions that are posed to people aren't authentic questions. And people just know that, and so they feel alienated. I think if you do it really well, really properly, explain to people what's going on. And in fact, there is lots of evidence of things like citizens' juries that, if you do them well, people come out at the end and they don't have... We used to say in the Labour Party, never underestimate people's knowledge, never underestimate their common sense. They come out of this process with a much kind of richer understanding and saying that they want to do it again. So I continue to believe that properly established deliberative processes where people are clear about what it is that's being asked of them, do work, they reach good decisions, they legitimize those decisions, and they engage people in really interesting ways. And we have to do that because electing a government, 32% of the people electing a government every 5 years is not the basis for making kind of big, hard decisions for the long term. So I kind of still believe in it, Hilary, but not many other people do.
Matthew, many, many thanks. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I'm very, very grateful to all of you and indeed to the various places around the country where people have been listening to this. The conversation has been really, really fascinating. The contribution's excellent. So let the conversation continue. I hope over a drink downstairs, I gather. Is that right?
Yeah,
Matthew?
if you want to go to the tavern room, you get a free drink, I think. Do they get a free drink? Yeah.
It's free.
Wow.
It's free.
Am I paying for it?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a free drink, and yeah, thank you so much for coming.
So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.